welcome aboard Celebrity Slave Ship. Departing the Gold Coast and making short stops in Bahia, Port-au-Prince, and Havana. We also ask that you please refrain from call and response singing between cabins, as that sort of thing can lead to rebellion. And of course, no drums are allowed on board. Have a nice day. Have a nice day. Have a nice day.
An exaggerated sense of self-importance, sense of entitlement, requiring constant, excessive admiration, expectation of having to be recognized as superior, even without achievements that difficulty, and stress from constant sense of their imperfection, in spite of insisting that they are better than others, which reveal secret feelings of insecurity, shame, and vulnerability.
How familiar. Long ago, when I was still employed, there was a conversation I had with an older black male coworker, which I think about more than I should. There I was, sitting outside, chatting it up with the nice ladies from the kitchen, when aforementioned older black male coworker joined us. Let's call him Cornell. Now, this is the first conversation I've had with Cornell, but eventually he comments on my nails being painted. I already knew where things were headed, so I prepared myself for a intellectually stimulating conversation for sure. Cornell then asked something along the lines of, do the girls like it? So I bluntly replied that I'm not doing it to attract women. You may have predicted that this is when things went left. He didn't follow it up by asking, not so subtly, if I was one of them homosexuals. Where the hell did he get that idea from? But I confirm. Then, and this is the inspiration behind the video, he asked me if I know my Lord and Savior. When I say it took all my inner strength to not revert back to my edgy Reddit atheist phase on this man, I ended up not becoming a Reddit atheist on him. Well, I don't recall exactly how we got there, but at some point I say that I don't worship a God who I wouldn't know of if my people were never enslaved. In hindsight, that is kind of going there. But anyway, what this high and mighty Christian had to say next floored me. Cornell said that slavery was punishment for black people for rebelling against or being estranged from God. And in Cornell's view, white people were the arbiters of God's will. I got fired that day. Not because of the conversation with Cornell or anything, it was actually something completely unrelated, but it's funny it happened the same day, right? He also added how out of control the youth are, black youth, and how we're like this because we're not in the church pews. And lately with this new trend of the YN, I think about this conversation a lot more. To me, Cornell is the exact reason my generation isn't as godly as the others. To me, Cornell is governed by fear. To me, these types of views are what creates this spectacle of the YN, the fear of black youth, and of blackness broadly, or black consciousness more precisely. Today I want to argue this fear of black youth by society is symptomatic of a broader fear of black consciousness. And this idea of the YN is just one way to get it done right. One way to make the public fear black consciousness. I'd argue that beliefs like Cornell's are exactly what's fueling this trend of black atheism, so to speak, or what we're going to call black nihilism, which is the idea we'll be concerning ourselves with today. This video will discuss nihilism and its relationship to anti-blackness and black consciousness, beginning with the fear of black youth being encouraged by the popularization of the term YN, and ending with an attempt to understand the real truth behind black nihilism. Are we just godless heathens, or the key to moving forward? All that and more answered in today's project. Before that though, a word from my sponsor, me. It's always me, and my super amazing, super sexy Patreons. This is my only income at the moment, so Patreons are kind of keeping me above water right now. All patrons get behind the scenes access to the progress of my projects, early access to videos, and my undying parasocial love. All tiers receive the same benefits, and you can get said benefits for as little as $1 a month. $1 a month? Golly, that's like $12 a year. I also have a Ko-Fi if you want to do a one-time donation. Sources are in the description, and with that said, let's discuss this ever-present fear of black youth being pushed through the spectacle of the YN. On June 22, 2003, Kentucky Governor Paul Patton reduced the death sentence of Kevin Stanford. Stanford's 1989 case resulted in a ruling that allowed for the execution of people who were at least 16 years old when they committed a crime. By the time they reduced his sentence in 2003, he'd been on death row for nearly 2 decades for a crime he committed when he was 17 and 81. In that same year, 2003, another case would challenge the minimum age to be killed by the state. Probably should chill if I want this video to be monetized. In that case, is Roper versus Simmons. Christopher Simmons had basically argued a new national consensus had evolved since the Supreme Court decision in Stanford that executing him for a crime he committed at age 17 would be cruel and unusual punishment. And luckily for him, the Supreme Court of Missouri agreed, and the U.S. Supreme Court announced the end of the juvenile death penalty on March 1st, 2003. Where's the fear of black youth, the impatient viewer may ask? In the 3 decades prior, 22 individuals under the age of 18 had been put to death in the U.S., right? And all but one of those executions happened in the South, but half of those people were black. And of course, over 75% of the victims that resulted in those executions were white. And this trend remains today for adults as well. In the South, a black man is much more likely to be put to death if he kills a white man than if he kills a black man. Since Roper, while executions of people below 18 are done for, we still have a disparity from 18 to 20. Since the Roper decision, more than 3/4 of the death sentences given to 18 to 20-year-olds have been imposed on people of color, who are twice as likely as white defendants in the same age group to be executed. So basically, we just moved the issue. Now, the logic of this is this 18 to 20-year-old group is more mature, more developed, right? That they're adults. But this isn't so easy to say either. The evidence points to a different story, actually. Studies of brain development and juvenile behavior show that key factors cited in the Roper decision, poor impulse control, unnecessary risk-taking, etc., are not only present in adolescents, but also present in 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. What we're asserting for this section is this cultural knowledge and patience of adolescence isn't afforded to black youth. In fact, it never was from the beginning. Before 1899, children accused of crimes were sent to criminal courts to be tried and prosecuted like adults. In the 19th century, progressive child savers, arguing that children were different from adults, sought to remove young people from adult prisons and create new specialized courts that would treat instead of punish them. Yet, from the outset, early juvenile justice reformers were not interested in treating or rehabilitating black youth. Instead, the first child welfare homes focused their efforts on normalizing or whitening European immigrants who were drawn to America. Black children, however, were never seen as worthy of these efforts. After emancipation, black children accused of crime in the South faced convict leasing and other forms of punishment. Progressive reformers viewed black children as a, quote, perennial lost cause, lacking the moral and intellectual capacity on which normalization would depend. While these homes educated and trained white youth, black youth received little, if any, recreation, education, or moral instruction. Black boys were trained to meet agricultural and other manual labor needs of the day. In my last dissertation, we mentioned a House of Reformation for colored boys, which is an example of this. It goes on to say that one could argue that progressives deliberately constructed juvenile courts to limit and control the freedom and success of poor immigrants, and thereby protect their own middle-class existence. I would argue that. As European immigration came to an end after World War I, black youth eventually replaced white immigrants as a target of juvenile court proceedings. And we fast forward to the present, black youth are not seen as children coming into themselves, but instead super predators, or as we say today, YNs. Unfortunately, adolescence as a character arc of finding yourself and making mistakes seems to be only afforded to not YNs. Adolescence was essentially invented by white middle-class parents to give their children an advantage in a changing Western world. In his book, Age of Opportunity, developmental psychologist Lawrence Steinberg teaches us that adolescence is the last period of significant flexibility in the brain, and psychologists remind us that it is a season of impulsivity and recklessness. Across a wide variety of activities, adolescents take more risks than either children or adults, with the likelihood of risky and reckless behavior usually peaking sometime during the late teens. Violence also increases during this age, as do self-inflicted injuries, unintentional drownings, drug experimentation, accidental pregnancies, property crime, and deadly car crashes. Parts of the brain that control our most advanced thinking, like logical reasoning, planning, and complicated decision-making, take longer to develop and are not fully mature until the early or mid-20s. Research shows that even young people who end up in court for serious crimes will age out of their behavior by late adolescence. I should read that again. Even young people who end up in court for serious crimes will age out of that behavior by late adolescence, and most will age out naturally, without significant court intervention. For black youth, adolescent mischief can mean a death sentence, or at least an excuse for police harassment and abuse. Racism and discrimination distort normal adolescent behaviors into crime and deviance among Black youth and deny them the grace and tolerance society extends to their peers. In fact, notwithstanding some differences in the type of drug, type of weapon, or age at onset of such behaviors, white youth report risky behaviors and rates similar to, and sometimes higher, than Black and Hispanic youth. Data on adolescent drug use paints this picture as well. Although Black youth tend to report using weed more often and at earlier ages than white youth are more likely to report using many other drugs by the 8th through the 12th grade. Hallucinogens, synthetic marijuana, and all other forms of prescription drugs such as oxycodone, Vicodin, tranquilizers, and amphetamines obtained without a doctor's prescription are just a few drugs that are more popular among white youth than Black youth. White youth are also more likely than Black youth to have tried or used electric vapor products. White youth also far outpace Black youth in all forms of alcohol use, including one-time experiences, binge drinking, and driving after drinking. Black youth who have greater access to more stereotypically frightening drugs like crack are demonized as violent criminals, while white youth who can afford more expensive drugs like powder cocaine, even though they're the same drug, are excused as impulsive and experimenting. Another classic example of this is the opioid epidemic. Insert Dave Chappelle skit here. So if the science and data tells us that white youth act a lot like Black youth, then why don't we treat Black youth the same? The answer is simple. We don't see Black children as children. We see them as YNs.
You're not protecting society if you just take kids and warehouse them for a few years and then put them back out on the street.
I suggest you're protecting society as long as you keep them off the street. And if the problem is we're not keeping them off the street long enough, that can be addressed in other ways.
A second wave of juvenile court reform coincided with the civil rights movement of the 1960s and lasted until the 1990s, when politicians rejected rehabilitation in favor of law and order. Responding first to the social unrest caused by racial tension and increased youth crime, lawmakers passed new laws such as the Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 to militarize the police force and prevent further disruption. In both waves, Black youth were demonized by the media and conservative politicians and portrayed as chief villains in the war on crime. In the wake of dehumanizing narratives about Black youth in the 1990s,
a super predator is a young juvenile criminal who is so impulsive, so remorseless, that he can kill, maim, without giving it a second thought.
Many states passed laws that would allow judges to impose harsher penalties on young offenders. States adopted mandatory minimum sentences, authorized lengthy periods of incarceration in state facilities, and crafted blended sentencing schemes that required youth to spend additional time in adult prison after completing their initial sentence in a youth facility.
The problem is we're not keeping them off the street long enough. That can be addressed in other ways.
Policymakers also adopted civil penalties, often called collateral consequences, to further punish and control youth who committed crimes. Most important, almost every state added or changed its law to allow, and in some cases require, prosecutors and judges to send even more children to adult courts at younger ages for more offenses and for longer periods of time.
The problem is we're not keeping them off the street long enough. That can be addressed in other ways.
As a result, between 1993 and 1999, the number of youth under the age of 18 held in adult jails more than quadrupled. In 2015, at least 75,000 youth under the age of 18 were prosecuted as adults in the U.S., although only 15% of all youth under juvenile court jurisdiction in the U.S. in 2018. Black youth accounted for more than 51% of all youth who were transferred by a judge from juvenile court to a criminal court that year. And these disparities remain for people who have committed similar crimes. These numbers only include youth who were transferred to adult court by a judge. No federal law requires states to collect data on other ways children may be sent to adult courts. That's to say these numbers are likely higher than we think, but aren't able to be counted since some are automatically listed as adults in some states. Widely held stereotypes that depict Black youth as violent and threatening overshadow our shared cultural belief that adolescents are capable of change. Implicit racial bias affects every stage of the criminal legal system, including decision-makers' views about the appropriate punishment for Black youth. In 1998, in one of the earliest studies on racial bias and youth sentencing, researchers reviewed 233 narrative reports written by probation officers in anticipation of a youth's disposition in juvenile court. It says in plain language what we've been asserting the whole time. The narrative revealed that probation officers were more likely to blame crime on external influences such as dysfunctional families, drug and alcohol use, difficulties at school, and the influence of delinquent peers when white youth were involved. Probation officers were significantly more likely to blame crime on internal personality traits, such as lack of remorse, lack of cooperation with the probation officer, and failure to take the proceedings seriously. When Black youth were involved, interpreting behaviors in this way made probation officers more likely to predict Black youth would reoffend in the future and recommend sentences longer than a sentencing guideline range. More recent studies confirm that racialized assumptions and attitudes about Black youth continue to inflame irrational fears and reduce public sympathy for those who have been accused. Kind of like the YN, which is always depicted as a thuggish Black youth. We could do so much better for our youth, but criminalizing them like this is not the answer, as history, data, etc. shows. We can do so many different alternatives. This report from the Community Alternatives to Confinement Achievement Equal or Better Outcomes at a Far Lower Cost review, god damn, that is a mouthful, found several types of community-based alternative programs. These include the expanded use of diversion, investing in alternatives to incarceration, limit the use of pretrial detention, prohibiting incarceration for low-level offenses, just to name a few. And all of these alternatives show much more promise and success than the law and order we've been doing. Now, with all that said, let's put down the books, the reports for a second and talk. I have opinions on a recent polarizing event. In April 2025, a 17-year-old stabbed another 17-year-old. In April 2025, a 17-year-old stabbed another 17-year-old in an altercation. The story is 17-year-old 1 was approached by 17-year-old 2 and asked to leave the area. Something about them not being allowed there. 17-year-old 1 refused and 17-year-old 2 doesn't back down either. I imagine no one wants to say they're wrong because no one wants to look weak. Things escalate and 17-year-old 1 stabs 17-year-old 2 in an altercation. 17-year-old 1 is pursued by police and he doesn't deny the crime, saying he's not alleged he did it. He stabbed the guy during the altercation and admitted it. He would then ask if 17-year-old 2 was okay, demonstrating surprise at the outcome. To me, the things people are saying about both sides have been removed from reality. Before I go on, remember that we just spent 15 oddish minutes detailing the troubles of adolescence. Okay, cool. The first irresponsible narrative I've heard is 17-year-old 1 having a knife was proof that this was premeditated. This is a legitimate argument people are poising, that he only had the knife because he planned to stab someone. And this is broken logic, right? I'm not crazy. To say the carrying of a weapon is premeditation is to act like every gun owner who concealed carries is planning to shoot someone every time they step outside their house. You have a weapon in case you need it, not because you want to go looking for trouble. And the second irresponsible narrative I've heard is, well, why was a child carrying a knife? Because kids carry knives sometimes. A teenager having a switchblade or whatever isn't some unique evil. It's not as uncommon as some people are making it out to be. And I know some of you watching went to school with some weirdo who had knives and didn't stab anyone. Maybe 17-year-old 1 lived in a sketchy area and wanted protection when walking alone. Maybe 17-year-old 1 collected knives. Maybe they just liked knives. Point being, I find it odd that seemingly no one has heard of a teenager carrying around a gas station knife. The final irresponsible claim is that this was intentional. Not that he premeditated, but he definitely meant to kill when he stabbed. I ask you again to remember what we just learned about adolescence. The immediate adult reaction is, well, you stabbed him. What did you think was going to happen? Which is understandable as an adult. But breaking news, teenagers are dumb. Groundbreaking. Unheard of even. Yes, he stabbed him, but not all stabs lead to death. He likely did a quick poke to scare him away and then went on about their business, not realizing how easily one can hit something vital, how much force to apply to not be lethal, etc., etc. He didn't stay to finish the job because he wasn't trying to kill. Teenagers are dumb. I shouldn't have to keep reminding the assumed antagonistic viewer of this. When he was confronted by police, he didn't run or deny that he stabbed 17-year-old 2. He then asked when he caught on that the situation was getting more serious if 17-year-old was okay. If he intended to kill, why ask if they're okay? You wouldn't know the answer. Why not try to even run or hide from police? To me, this is a case of teenage recklessness and some masculine chest beating gone too far. Teens fight and teens sometimes carry weapons. It's not a good mix, but 17-year-old 1 is not a psychotic murderer waiting for the next chance. We can confidently assume they're not going to go out and murder someone. He's a dumb teenager, just like 17-year-old 2 likely was. A life has been lost, but it doesn't mean we need to lose too. The judicial system has given passes to people who have done much worse. Ethan Couch comes to mind. I can't help but feel that 17-year-old one has become a spectacle that represents people's fear of the YN. And I think this fear of Black youth is the underlying fear of Black consciousness.
To recap, our argument is basically that this fear of Black youth displayed through the spectacle of the YN is actually a broader fear of Black consciousness. But what is Black consciousness and why is it feared? To understand Black consciousness, it's useful to first understand white consciousness, or what white consciousness desires and, more importantly for this act, fears. Put another way, what is whiteness and those consciously or unconsciously motivated by it desire? In a word, everything. Gordon tackles this desire for everything a few different ways. Starts with examining white people's relationship to animals, right? Commenting how often people who would not hesitate to roll with lions or swim with sharks and shit are the same people who wouldn't hesitate to call the police on a Black person. He says they seem incapable of imagining animals as wild, and additionally that they seem to believe that animals follow a don't harm white people rule. Whiteness encourages a perverse perception of animals. There are more tigers in people's homes in the US than left in the wild in Asia, and one can be assured that most of the tiger owners are white. Tiger King? White people shit. There's also no shortage of white victims to animal attacks. Then he talks about jobs. Such a consciousness treats a limitation as an intrinsic evil. Think of the outrage, the cries of reverse discrimination when Blacks are hired in universities, where the white population is often in excess of 90%. He also shares his experience as an assistant professor when he was one of 15 Black faculty and complaints came up about affirmative action and worries about white people having a job. I was curious at first, since I didn't see other Black faculty during those strolls between classes, and then I realized those complaints were about me. Imagine the point of view of the aggrieved white students and staff. When I walked by, they saw a Black that day. Already one too many. There were also Black memento policies in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Mexico, Uruguay, and Venezuela. Black memento was this policy of eugenics through controlling Black procreation, and also adding economic incentives for white immigrants that weren't awarded to Black immigrants. Here we can see that becoming whiter is an economic reward. This desire for everything also leads whiteness to harm itself in order to try and retain power. And this can be examined with the healthcare situation in the US. In Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl, he shares a story of Trevor, someone who is against Medicaid or Obamacare, even though it would objectively probably save their life. You can't say objectively and probably, it would help. Even on death's doorstep, Trevor wasn't angry. In fact, he staunchly supported the stance promoted by his elected officials. Ain't no way I would ever support Obamacare or sign up for it. I would rather die. We don't need any more government in our lives. And in any case, no way I want my tax dollars paying for Mexicans or welfare queens. Metzl goes on to say that Trevor was a victim of dogma, but for our discussion, I want to be a bit more pointed. It wasn't just any dogma. It was racist dogma. It was white supremacist dogma. Trevor died by white dogma. With this understanding, we can read the following quote as, Trevor's deteriorating condition resulted also from the toxic effects of white dogma. White dogma that told him that government assistance in any form was evil and not to be trusted. White dogma, as he made abundantly clear, aligned with beliefs about a racial hierarchy. White dogma suggesting to Trevor that minority groups receive lavish benefits from the state, even though he himself lived and died on a low-income budget state assistance. Trevor voiced a literal willingness to die for his place in the hierarchy. Trevor lived and died for whiteness. Trevor's white consciousness is what led to his demise. And Trevor's story is pretty much an explanation of why we don't have universal healthcare in the US at all. Yes, racism is a reason we don't have healthcare. I'd like to share the story of Senator Claude Pepper of Florida. He was a huge proponent of national healthcare, and it seemed the idea was popular, but then racism attacked. The American Medical Association is a trade group of doctors known to most Americans now for its labeling on consumer products. But in the 1940s, it acted as a scorched earth lobbying group whose leadership viewed any kind of insurance that mediated between the patient and doctor with suspicion. The AMA launched the first modern public relations and lobbying campaign to paint government assistance as a threat not to doctors' finances but to the American way of life. They labeled the idea socialist,
and also threw in some racism, which always helps in American politics. Red baiting tapped into many white Americans' fears about what it would mean in the US to mandate equality, an end to white supremacy. After Pepper came out as a champion of government-funded healthcare and other liberal programs, he became the prime target in the 1950 election. The effort to unseat him was coordinated by a campaign led by wealthy businessmen who opposed Pepper's economic liberalism, including his support for higher wages and taxes. And Truman could not get the segregationist caucus of the South, the Southern Dixiecrat Democrats in his party, behind his vision of national health care because they didn't want to give it to black people, even though the beneficiaries of this would have been overwhelmingly white. By the 1960s, President Johnson created the Medicare and Medicaid, but had to concede to leave whether and how to offer Medicaid to the individual states, and a compromise with racism, and this has curtailed the program's reach for decades. Medicaid was intended to ensure all Americans living in poverty by 1970, but by 1985, less than half of low-income families were covered, and corporations began cutting back on offering health benefits to their employees in the 1980s, and this led to the number of insurers skyrocketing. As of 2020, we still have no universal health plan, or concepts of one, might I add. I mean, think of the people who are super against Obamacare, but also very supportive of the Affordable Care Act. Again, whiteness wants to retain power, so much so it will harm itself to do so. And this is described as a zero-sum thinking. So this fear is often a fear of losing on something because someone else gained, if that makes sense. In the 1950s, the majority of white Americans believed that the government should guarantee a job to anyone who wanted one and provide a minimum standard of living in a country. But white support for these ideas cratered between 1960 and 1964, going from 65% to 35%. And it has stayed low ever since. Gee, I wonder what happened between those years. As the civil rights movement successfully shifted cultural norms and beliefs, it became rare to hear arguments that people of color were biologically inferior. That kind of old-fashioned racism was quickly losing favor. The dominant story most white Americans believe about race adapted to the civil rights movement, and now the racial disdain is based on perceived culture and behavior, and they define this as racial resentment. Although white support for the principles of racial equality and integration have increased majestically over the last 4 decades, their backing for policies designed to actually bring about equality and integration has scarcely increased at all, and in some cases it has actually declined. We want equality. Here's the equality bill. That's DEI, therefore woke and gay. White people with high levels of resentment against black people have become far more likely to oppose government spending generically as of the data in 2016. Government had become a highly racialized character in the white story of our country. When the people with power in a society see a portion of the populace as inferior and undeserving, their definition of the public becomes conditional, which is to say, public goods are only good for the public we perceive to be good. Another fear of the white consciousness is fear of responsibility. They say they confuse personal responsibility with political responsibility. The question of political responsibility challenges 2-century-old fallacies about political action towards social transformation. The first is that somewhere out there's a group of people who have got things right, and all we have to do is find them and copy them, and all things will come to fruition. We just need to be like the Greeks or the Romans. Never mind all that bad stuff they did. They had their reasons. You see, a society is like a garden, and sometimes gardens have weeds that need to be removed. Shakespeare wishes he was a more better writer than I. The second fallacy seeks legitimacy in crowds, wherein a large enough crowd can supposedly fix anything. The Spanish philosopher Jose Ortega Gasset called this mass man. Mass man is the enemy of wisdom, skill, expertise, and of anything that would distinguish an individual in any way that makes him or her a minority. A large mass embodies force but rarely intelligence. The working class is not a mass because, as a class, it's distinguished by the labor it offers, which requires a broad range of experience and skills. An unhealthy society regards skilled or distinguished individuals with resentment, envy, and disdain. Arrogance follows where those with a mass mentality presume they can do anything without the skill and time necessary for its fruition, or at least without the development of competence. In their view, they have a right to everything, without accountability. The right to everything, which involves also doing whatever one pleases, requires extremes. As having it all is impossible, this mentality cultivates resentment at not having it all. The bane of mass people's existence is a lack of legitimacy.
failure to achieve it leads them to wage a war on clarity, evidence, facts, fairness, intelligence, persuasiveness, and truth in favor of sheer will. And this fuels their decline into fascism. The white conscious also fears falling into irrelevancy. And I interpret this as the desire to keep the charade of whiteness going, right? As James Boggs puts it, it is not only the white liberal who suffers from the need to be needed. Theoretically, the Marxists are worse than the liberals. The Marxists recognize that a revolution is involved in the Negro struggle, but still they want the Negro to depend upon a white worker being with them. The Negro worker who works in a shop knows that if he's going to depend on the white worker, he will never get anywhere. The average white worker isn't joining any liberal organizations. If anything, he's joining the Klan. When the Negro fights, he fights not in his last analysis, but in reality. His enemy is not just a class, his enemy is people. And the people are American whites of all classes, including workers. Or as an Afro-pessimist would say, his enemy is the human. To close this section off before going into the hard philosophy, while white supremacy is a thesis that whites must be superior and have everything, anti-black racism is a conviction that blacks must have nothing. Rejecting both involves understanding that all people deserve something and that an all or nothing mentality presents a false dilemma. Fear of black consciousness makes sense then in a society where white supremacists and anti-black racists desire to see without seeing the displeasing truth of what they have produced in the system of injustice on which they depend, namely human degradation and the foreclosure of the breadth of human potential. Gnarly.
I think, therefore I am, but I am black, therefore I am not. This act relies on Black Nihilism by Devin R. Johnson. It's very simple. If the book discusses blackness and philosophy, then I will be making a video on it. We're not called PhilosyNoir for funsies. So this section will be focusing on what Johnson calls weak or white nihilism, which he argues structures the anti-black values that structure our society. He then offers black nihilism as an antidote, so to speak. Longtime fans can consider this a continuation / conclusion of my Afro-pessimism video with a perhaps more satisfying conclusion. This video is what happens when nihilism is painted black, capital B. I'm not sure what that means, but it sounded way cooler in my head. But before getting into the different types of black and white nihilism, I'd like to speak on something tangentially related and arguably a bit petty. In the aforementioned Afro-pessimism video, we also spoke about black optimism from the view of Coleman Hughes. I won't rehash what we said in that video, but if you don't know, positions himself as the opposition to any black radical politics. And I'd say he's probably most known for his debate with Ta-Nehisi Coates on reparations, where he took the anti-reparation stance. And most recently, he came out as a defender of the Galactic Empire. He's the centrist / independent who just so happens to mainly push thinly veiled conservative politics. The centrist / independent who just so happens to criticize how far the left has gone. The centrist / independent who, okay, you get the picture. I hate centrist / independents who call themselves independents but end up just defending conservatism. So some time ago, Coleman Hughes was on one of the largest philosophy channels on a platform. Alex O'Connor, previously known as the Cosmic Skeptic, a creator whose content I've enjoyed in the past. They were a major factor in me deciding to make philosophy my minor. They gave teenage me arguments to defend myself against homophobic evangelical rhetoric, and obviously played a large part in me becoming less religious overall. All that to say, Alex O'Connor inadvertently supported the pursuit of philosophy on his channel. PhilosyNoir exists to answer the unfortunate question born of profound ignorance that I've heard and still hear in different forms today. That question being, how come there is no black philosophers? There were and are. It's just the question of whether or not you exist seems quite obvious when there's a cross burning in your yard insisting that you don't. But anyway, when I, PhilosyNoir, which translates to black philosophy, PhilosyNoir, saw Coleman Hughes on one of the largest philosophy channels on the platform, I was not thrilled. One, because
it should have been me, not him! It's not fair!
And two, is fucking Coleman Hughes. And I know it's not just me. The comment section of the video seems to be quite critical of the decision as well. On the off chance Alex or someone who is in contact with him is watching, I'd like to ask you speak with someone opposed to Coleman's philosophy. My issue boils down to this being one of the maybe only times I've seen black philosophy on a channel, and you engage with someone who tries to pacify black people with, it's not all that bad rhetoric. To put this bluntly, Coleman is a contrarian and a mediocre choice if you're going to introduce an audience to black philosophy. And the decision to interview him and not be sufficiently prepared to challenge his ideals or have on someone who can is a show of ignorance at best and highly irresponsible at worst. On the off chance Alex or someone who's in contact with him is watching, I'd like to ask you speak with someone opposed to Coleman's philosophy, if not for a better perspective and understanding of the black philosophical tradition, then for balance or whatever. Preferably me, but in all seriousness, anyone will do. This is the first time I'm using my audience to try and get someone else's attention, so let me be clear. The goal of this statement is acknowledgement and maybe a conversation, but not likely. We're just trying to hopefully get them to have someone who's more respected in black philosophical circles on. Not to say that I am by any means, but not to say that I'm respected and known in black philosophical circles. I'm just a guy with a camera, but you know what I mean. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get into this act by exploring what Johnson calls weak or white nihilism. We'll begin with a statement that I hope will make more sense by the end of the section. I think, therefore I am, but I am black, therefore I am not. In a way, the philosophy of white nihilism is what we previously described as white consciousness, the desire to maintain a racial hierarchy, to buy into the ideals that uphold its falsity, are clearly present in what Johnson describes as white nihilism. But Johnson focuses on the why. Why is whiteness clung to? Why insist upon its superiority despite being based in falsity? Why does whiteness insist on anti-blackness? It's argued that this is a cover for a profound lack of meaning, that this veil of whiteness is to shroud them from the meaninglessness of their own existence. His interpretation is admittedly not the way these texts were meant to be used, but I think the point Johnson is trying to make is that which is not said by these philosophers kind of paints the issues that they say are inherent to man. It's realizing your values can't be ordained beyond a human. Or at least that's my interpretation. Anti-black racist ideals of whiteness seek to cloak themselves from pessimism and nihilism. As a subject of European philosophical reflection, nihilism is akin to the historical emergence of anti-black racism in Western life, since both proceed from the cultivation of existential categories pertaining to Enlightenment forms of imperial reasoning and colonization, or the construction of man. The result has been an attempt to make the ideals of European man function like the primordial will of the universe. Johann Fichte openly wondered whether universal truth and order were nothing more than products of imagination, ultimately produced for the purposes of keeping purposelessness at bay. Fichte could be considered among the first European nihilists because he rejected metaphysical affirmations of the value of European man, but it was Nietzsche, through Schopenhauer, who offered the most explicit and honest descriptions of nihilism of European man as a dependence on metaphysical affirmations. So Nietzsche considered those who depend on metaphysical affirmations for value as a type of nihilist. But not the kind of nihilist Nietzsche is. As we know, he is very original, very different, very annoying. The suffering of man is due, apparently, to his struggles to metaphysically affirm meaning within a universe that inherently rejects such meaning. They cope with this lack of meaning by creating realities that exist in the realm of imagination, according to Johnson. Even more disturbing, they display an implicit acceptance of the need to continuously reinforce these projections. I interpret this to mean that they're attempting to produce the world they want to live in, and art, or the way art can be used, is a solution to this desire, because art projects a symbolic reality with aim to make it real, for lack of better phrasing, right? And Schopenhauer and Nietzsche agree that nihilism and pessimism toward life could be tolerated, if not overcome, through artistic production and absorption. Schopenhauer confessed that European man was situated within a cosmological universe in which reality beyond the human world of projected values consists of purely blind, contradictory, immutable, self-justified universal will. The result of this affair is that man has become the author of the concept of objective value, not the translator of it. I like to recall something from Stanley we read in the past that I think kind of speaks to this illusion of objectivity. There is in fact no coherence to the notion of perspective-free inquiry. All inquiry takes a stand, at a minimum, a commitment to logical forms of reasoning and basic assumptions about reality. In many cases, inquiry also makes moral presumptions. To take an example from the philosopher Judith Jarvis Thompson, it is a moral stance to say that torturing babies for fun or for profit is wrong. Yet, in the strict sense, this can be constructed as a bias. It is taking a stance on a view without argument. The demand for neutral inquiry is ultimately philosophically incoherent. Returning to Johnson, if universal reality is a blind, irrational force, willing existence for absolutely no reason at all, then nothing European man wills can have objective value. Thus, according to Schopenhauer, he is aware that there are no values that can be said to be valued for their own sake. And here's where Nietzsche comes in. Nietzsche's evaluation of Schopenhauer's pessimism is what led him to pejoratively consider all traditional modern Western philosophy as European nihilism. Nihilism for Nietzsche, however, is a term describing human life as it lives the death of traditional values and attempts to transvalue modes of valuing to replace them. It entails the situation of realizing the meaning and significance of one's projections cannot be metaphysically affirmed. And here's where we get into the different types of nihilism. Stick with me. A nihilistic situation can be complete or incomplete, and either strong or weak, or active and passive. Incomplete nihilism admits a devaluation of traditional values while struggling to adequately replace them. The struggle to replace the now devalued values is what's key here. But complete nihilism faces the project of valuing in the absence of metaphysically affirmed values. This can be divided into two categories: active and passive, or strong and weak in this discussion. An ability to remain insistent on the value of one's values, active against impositions of denial, takes strength, hence the name active or strong nihilism. Passivity signals weakness and inability or unwillingness to insist upon a value of one's value in the face of denials, hence passive or weak nihilism. What we're calling weak nihilism responds to the fall of traditional values by denying the value of human valuing altogether, or relying on the metaphysical to affirm one's value. Strong nihilism, on the other hand, rejects decadent values while seeking to create ways of valuing beyond this metaphysical weak nihilism. It says no to going along with tradition for tradition's sake, or at least that's my interpretation. Quoting from Nietzsche, "At the bottom, man has lost faith in his own value when no infinitely valuable whole works through him. He concedes such a whole in order to be able to believe in his own value." Here we can see Nietzsche admit that man lost faith in his value, which he needs in order to be able to believe in his own value. Man, European man, needs God to affirm that he's valuable, morally just, correct, and that only he can be these things. God acted as a force for denying the value of science, truth, facts, and logic, etc. God decides the meaning, the God that no one can verify to exist beyond the mind of the human. Philosophical systems attempting to stop the inevitable external processes of structuring meaning within reality, the refusal to imagine more, to acknowledge more, to rely on the metaphysical as a cop-out for what you believe, the choice to commit philosophical suicide, is weak nihilism. From the perspective developed so far, we could ask, is anti-black racism a form of weak nihilism, since it too relies on metaphysical, unproven values? Well, yes. Let us call this marriage white nihilism. I think, therefore I am, but I am black, therefore I am not. Anti-black racism is a form of weak nihilism because it attempts to arrest human development by destroying the possibility of producing values beyond the imagined metaphysical affirmations of ideals supporting anti-black racist conceptions of whiteness. The weak nihilism of anti-black racism is characterized by its reliance on vibes. No facts, no new info, no changing, no correcting, and anyone who tries must be dealt with. Modern anti-black racism is part and parcel of the historical value systems of European man, who imagine all phenomenal activity, but especially rational cognition, through restrictive conceptions of humanity as racially white. He imagined himself as the only human existing in a physical world of nature, animals, and brutes, only dared to be mastered by him. I think, therefore I am, but I am black, therefore I am not. And Nietzsche's work can be interpreted as supporting this theorization that these anti-black racist societies are nothing more than adapted worlds which they need to feel real. Quoting Nietzsche, "Our particular case is interesting enough. We have produced a conception in order to be able to live in a world, in order to perceive just enough to endure it." He also wrote, "Appearance is an arranged and simplified world at which our practical instincts have been at work. It is perfectly true for us, that is to say, we are able to live in it. It is essentially a world of relationships. Under certain conditions, it has a differing aspect from every point." And what we're reading here is Nietzsche admit that the world of European man is merely a world of appearances. Traditional Western philosophy has proceeded according to weak nihilistic values, including the idea that racially white people exclusively possess human capacity to produce values, such as, quote, truth. For example, I learned in Fear of Black Consciousness that a Haitian intellectual was barred from speaking at the Anthropology Society of France in 1844, despite being an invited member. Some modern European thinkers even claimed Europeans had an entirely different evolutionary ancestry from Africans. The biological and anthropological arguments of Benair, Voltaire, J.G. von Herder, and J.F. Blumenbach, to name a few, helped to establish a white normative sensibility of modern European thought concerning the human category. And this also included Francis Galton's eugenic claims that the health of the human race depended upon conquering and eliminating, quote, degenerative races. If you're unaware of who Francis Galton is, he's like the MVP of eugenics. An Empire of Normality is said that to understand Galton's work, it's important to note that he soon became obsessed with genius, a term he identified with, as well as with ranking humans in every way imaginable. Galton hypothesized while studying at Cambridge that the fact that Cambridge was full of middle-class white men might indicate that this demographic was constitutionally superior to everyone else. Yeah, that's why. In this, he saw the hierarchies of the British Empire not as contingent and based on specific historical factors, but rather as an expression of natural superiority that could be scientifically verified. This led him to become a very influential statistician, also founding a variety of fields, and coining the term eugenics. He was also the first man to statistically rank women from different areas in terms of attractiveness. The second was Mark Zuckerberg. Galton, after dedicating the last few decades of his life to eugenics, died in 1911, with his writings on eugenics having inspired a global movement made up of leading politicians, scientists, and philosophers of the generation. Mustache Man, driven by the ideologies of nationalism, racism, and eugenics, eventually came to see society itself as an organism. In this view, a society's individual members were understood as either stronger or weaker compared to each other on a more or less Galtonian model. And because society itself was an organism, the weaker individuals were seen as weakening the whole organism. Those who were seen as unable to conform to the bad guy racial and economic requirements, those whose minds and bodies fell outside the norm, were thus seen as parasitic problems to be eliminated. Society is like a garden, remember? Given these views, they began implementing authoritarian eugenic laws and policies. This included the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, which prescribed compulsory sterilization for thousands of neurodivergent people, including those diagnosed with schizophrenia and cognitive disabilities. New Galtonian psychometric and psychological methods were also used to determine who was stronger or weaker and thus who should be able to live and reproduce. In practice, this helped justify how mentally ill ill and intellectually disabled children and adults were classified, assessed, sterilized, and in many cases, murdered in large numbers alongside Jews and other targets. Almost 300,000 people with schizophrenia alone are thought to have been sterilized or murdered in Germany between 1939 and 1945. In fact, it was in bad guy occupied Austria that autism was coined as a diagnosis. While the term autism had been coined by the eugenicist Eugene Bueller, Bueller only meant this to refer to a temporary symptom of schizophrenia. It was under bad guy rule in the work of Hans Asperger that those who came to be called autistic were singled out as having a unique way of being. During a war period where men were expected to express a soldier mentality and be part of the group, boys who failed to fit this economic requirement were singled out as pathological and were baptized with the new name, autism. Those women who were diagnosed with autism were seen as unfit to reproduce. It was a significant part of their gender norms determined by ideological and economic factors that first allowed autism to manifest as a distinct way of being. In this context, Hans Asperger began dividing autistics into different categories. Those deemed to have potential worth to the Third Reich given their purportedly strong logical capacities, and those who were going to be sterilized or killed along with the other countless, quote, mad and disabled targets. That part was written like months ago and it was supposed to be a joke about RFK. Has a whole different light now. Returning to Johnson. And we also know, of course, that Kant is a MVP of eugenics as well. Kant once wrote, "The Negro countries were, on being discovered, looked upon as countries which belonged to nobody, for the native inhabitants were reckoned as nothing." Here, black people are literally described as non-entities, invisible, nothing or nobody, for whom the human rights of autonomy apply. I think, therefore I am, but I am black, therefore I am not. In anthropology, from a pragmatic point of view, Kant directly argued that the global domination of black people is best for all of humanity. I think, therefore I am, but I am black, therefore I am not. For Hegel, black humanity was the opposite of human consciousness. It was marked by an inability to experience itself. Black humanity for Hegel was, quote, an animal man. Animal man is crazy. All that to say, these European philosophers that we have discussed so far are white nihilists. White nihilism refers to anyone who values in such a way as to make the, quote, implicit notion of white supremacy unavoidable if one wishes to have any hope for knowledge formation and understanding of reality. Pessimistic lack of meaning for white humanity is that which has been most feared and is the cause of greatest suffering. Weak nihilistic whites seek to erase blacks in order to make white life valuable, bearable, and good. Black humanity threatens that which holds white existential life together. Without blackness to deny as non-existence against which to positively project meaning, without blackness removed as a source of value in human affairs, whiteness is left alone, irrelevant, feeling nothing more for itself than pain, suffering, exhaustion, boredom, and drives towards suicide. Anti-black racism is motivated in significant part then by modern European philosophical attempts to deny the pessimistic truth of human condition, and partially by a fear of facing the project that we live in a world of others with whom meaning is nihilistically forged. Thus, white nihilism is a philosophical denial of black humanity that evidences its own failures, a flight from the pessimistic truth of the human condition, a condition wherein the truth lurking behind whiteness is an abysmal nothingness of meaning. We can end this section with asking, how should the anti-human, the black, respond to this situation? What value is left for those who are barred from inquiry? In other words, how does black consciousness react to the nihilistic situation? Let's say you're feeling down because you've realized for the first time the world is a bit shit. You feel hopeless when you look around and see all the hypocrisy and caveats on things you were told all your life. Killing is bad, you were told. But not if the government does it. Stealing is wrong, you're told. Unless it's to claim land from savages. Everyone is equal, you're told. But apparently some people are savages and don't deserve equality. Let's also say you weren't raised religious, so asking God for answers isn't really considered. But you start to wonder if you should. I mean, compared to your current state, the churchgoers seem grounded and not not in existential despair at least, maybe they're onto something. You didn't make the grave mistake of telling your Reddit atheist friend. They inform you that God's not real, and then proceed to go on a 10-minute tangent about the implications of God having omniscience in the Garden of Eden story, and somehow relates it to stamp collecting. I don't know, you weren't really paying attention. This is PhilosyNoir on the nihilistic encounter. The bit right before you decide God or Reddit is the incomplete nihilism. You haven't made a choice, so the metaphysical value that the church offers is absent. Recall, incomplete nihilism is characterized by absence of metaphysical affirmations. So you passively decide to give God a try, only to find out he has the absolute worst fandom, and you thought Swifties were bad. And you also don't vibe with the resignation to suffering in exchange for a cozy afterlife, because you don't like the original life. Why the hell would I want to do this twice? But wait, there's more. You realize you're black, and this can be applied to the issue of persisting anti-blackness in society. You start to search for answers, or at least ways of thinking that help you feel a bit less doomerish. This is the nihilistic situation painted black. This is where we explore black nihilism. Recall the conversation I mentioned in the beginning with a coworker. It can apply to our discussion of nihilism. That's to say, who should black people be putting their faith in? God or ourselves? Let's see what Johnson thinks. He uses Cornel West as an example of weak black nihilism. Black American Christianity relies on metaphysically affirmed values aimed at warding against the black pessimism accompanying anti-black racism. One example is how black Christian traditions make sense of black suffering and struggles through a symbolic/metaphysical linkage between the lore of Jesus and historical overcoming of black suffering. Black Christianity ultimately places the power to effect political transformation in God's will. Cornel West's view of black nihilism isn't the same as Johnson's, but we can use what West views as black nihilism to see how his philosophy is what we've defined as weak nihilism. The difference being it's being applied to black beings, so let's call it weak black nihilism. In the view of Cornel West, the weak black nihilist or traditional black Christian, black nihilism is a form of despair over a lack of meaning and estrangement from God and self, heavy on the estrangement from God. Using Kierkegaard as an analog, Johnson argues that this view sees nihilism as an inherently negative mindset, basically, that feels no optimism or hope for improvements, and perhaps most importantly, an estrangement from God, which I interpret as becoming atheist or agnostic, or maybe just not falling in line with traditional Christianity. To them, it's basically atheism derogatory. This view of black nihilism is incorrect. The bit about estrangement from God has truth in a sense, I guess, but the statement estrangement from God implies the existence of a God, so the charge is kind of mute. To them, it's inherently negative to not be of God's everlasting love club. To us being the estranged, both queer and non-queer, view them as weak nihilists because they're placing their values, their faith in the metaphysics, God. To place liberation in God's hands is to have metaphysical values. This is what we've described as weak nihilism. Let's return to second person. Your issues with black struggle in the church is that this Bible has also been used to justify your oppression. You learned that from the aforementioned edgy atheist friend, so you grow skeptical of waiting for God to strike down the racists. But you're still seeing this persisting issue of anti-blackness and become convinced that this issue is with humanity or deconstruction of humanity in general. You start to hypothesize, if the world truly believes that you're human. This is near what we'd call Afro-pessimism, which in Johnson's view is still a type of weak black nihilism. However, I disagree. Take this with a grain of salt because this is just my opinion, but I think Afro-pessimism fits more neatly into incomplete nihilism. What we've previously defined as incomplete nihilism is characterized by the project of facing value when the absence of metaphysically affirmed ones. Afro-pessimism doesn't rely on metaphysically affirmed values and clearly faces the struggle of valuing. I would argue Afro-pessimism is a nihilistic encounter, so to speak, since one has no answer. Johnson even uses the term pessimism to describe the incomplete nihilism of European man. If we're using them as an analog, this, in my view, is incomplete nihilism, or incomplete black nihilism. That's just me. Let's see what Johnson's case is. Wilderson displays weakness in the face of black nihilism. He describes black pessimism but collapses before seeing how it can become active and strong, or occasion newer ways of being that can lead to free political realities. Rather than considering how strong black nihilistic perspectives can help pave the way, enabling the emergence of black political demands, out of which healthy political arrangements can be fought for, and one, Wilderson laments black invisibility. He appears inconsolably forlorn about the black preclusion from white worlds. But why lament so deeply black inability to join the anti-black world? Why should anyone want to join that world? Still standing by my argument of this being incomplete nihilism, but As I said years ago, Afro-pessimism, more like Afro-doomerism. But what about the other side? What about these strong Black nihilists? What do? Strong nihilists seek to respond healthily to the absurdity of the human condition by valuing freedom and responsibility and value production. From the strong Black nihilistic perspective, existentialism is optimistic, a doctrine of action. It turns towards man as the one responsible for the world. Sartre once wrote, "When we say that a man is responsible for himself, we do not only mean that he is responsible for his own individuality, but that he is responsible for all men. In creating the man that we want to be, there is not a single one of our acts which does not, at the same time, create an image of man as we think he ought to be." Floyd Hayes III argues that the Black nihilist is led through the absurdities of Black invisibility to a double vision of human meaning, wherein the pessimistic truth of each person being radically responsible for producing value conflicts with the idealistic languages of certain political and religious programs. Recall what was said about the white worker in Part 2. In the words of Albert Camus, the nihilist is not the one who believes in nothing, but one who does not believe in what exists. Hayes correctly points out that the nihilist rejects as absurd the values and laws articulated by the dominant culture, which itself devalues its own values and breaks its own laws. The Black nihilist in particular expresses profound doubt about traditional cultural formulations of human life in anti-Black racist societies. The nihilist is a rebel, explains Hayes, filled with resentment that can lead to rebellion against the absurdity of certain values. Afro-absurdism? Afro-absurdism. In other words, the strong Black nihilistic gaze should aim to shoot, pierce through, and go beyond the anti-Black racist world toward an existentially free world, and not seek restoration within this nihilistically weak one. The Black nihilistic situation involves valuing against value structures of whiteness, which render Black values inherently meaningless. Seeking to establish political realities based upon values justified solely in the terms of each human's freedom and responsibility for constructing human reality as a goal. The Promethean endeavor to transvalue white nihilistic humanity from the existential space of Black invisibility is an utterly nihilistic task, and indeed, the weak perish of it. Top shit. There's a lot more to the text that I cited today that didn't make into the video, so I highly recommend that you just check out my source list, or just stay tuned. I highly doubt this is the last time we'll be using these texts. But that, my friends, is strong Black nihilism. Before you go, a few things. I strongly encourage you start to download educational videos like this and others in the event they suddenly become illegal. Kidding. Second, this is my only income at the moment, so all donations, Patreon, Ko-Fi, whatever you have, whatever you can give is always welcome. And third, if you haven't subscribed, you haven't to the end of the credits before I release the hounds. See you when I see you, and in the words of Albert Camus, remember to create dangerously.